You can replace the sign now, Mrs. Langford, or the association can make the decision for you. Morning settled over Copper Beach Court in pale sunlight, catching on wet lawns and the brass numerals beside Lenora Langford's front door. A sprinkler clicked across the neighbor's grass, while a landscaping truck near the entrance backed up with 3 soft electronic beeps. The air carried the mineral smell of damp concrete and freshly cut clover. Lenora said nothing. Meredith Vance stood on the front walk in a wine-colored blazer, cream blouse, and narrow heels that sank into the seam between 2 paving stones. A laminated HOA badge hung from her lapel, and a leather-covered clipboard rested against one hip like an official seal. Behind her, the association's white golf cart idled at the curb, its small motor giving off a warm plastic smell. She looked rehearsed. Lenora, 61 and widowed, held a ceramic mug with both hands and studied Meredith's expression rather than the clipboard. Her silver blonde hair moved lightly in the breeze, and her charcoal cardigan nearly disappeared against the shadowed doorway. She had lived at the end of the cul-de-sac for 12 years without joining a committee, disputing a landscaping schedule, or speaking longer than necessary at an annual meeting. People mistook quiet for uncertainty. Meredith tapped the brass house numbers with one polished fingernail and announced that the serif lettering violated the new community numeral standard. She claimed uniform numbers supported emergency visibility, neighborhood harmony, and property values, though nearly every house displayed a different style installed by a different builder. The brass plate had been chosen by Lenora's husband years before Meredith joined the board. It stayed. The replacement window is 7 calendar days, Meredith said, sliding a red compliance tag beneath the storm door handle. Printed across the top was courtesy observation notice, followed by a warning that a $219.84 facade numeral uniformity assessment could be imposed only after formal notice was mailed to the owner's verified address and the required cure period expired. Beneath it sat a $53.67 visual address confirmation charge, payable even if Lenora replaced the numbers herself. Precision made nonsense look official. Lenora lifted the tag, read every line, and asked when the standard had been adopted. She requested the recorded vote, the effective date, and the section authorizing the rule to apply to fixtures installed before its passage. Her voice remained low enough that the sprinkler sounded loud between each question. Meredith's smile tightened. She replied that the board did not need to relitigate settled community policy on individual doorsteps. She said cooperation was expected, not negotiated, and wrote something on the clipboard with 3 deliberate strokes. At the curb, the golf cart motor clicked as it cooled. Lenora went inside and returned with a small notebook. She recorded the date, 8:17 a.m., the weather, Meredith's exact wording, and both fees listed on the notice. Meredith watched as if the act of documentation were a personal insult. Documentation is not defiance, Lenora said. For the first time, Meredith looked offended, as though a resident had crossed a boundary only she could see. She turned toward the golf cart, heels scraping against the concrete, then glanced back at the old brass numerals glowing in the sun. There are several ways to bring an owner into compliance, she said. Lenora closed the notebook, then used the proper one. The first formal mailed notice Lenora never received was printed 2 days later in the management office beside the community pool, with a copier hummed beneath fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of chlorine, toner, and reheated coffee. Meredith Vance stood at the terminal in her wine-colored blazer while the association's part-time administrator, Paula Mercer, reviewed the resident account on the screen. Lenora's address had always appeared as 27 Copper Beach Court, with no apartment, suite, or secondary unit attached to the property. Then Meredith added 2 words, Unit B. Paula leaned closer and reminded her that the house was a single-family residence, but Meredith called the change an administrative correction required for internal routing consistency. She clicked Save before Paula could ask who had authorized it. The system recorded the new address at 4:42 p.m. By sunset, a certified letter had been generated for 27 Copper Beach Court, Unit B, carrying the $219.84 assessment. the existing $53.67 visual address confirmation charge, and a new $88.31 non-response continuation fee. The envelope passed through the association's mailing vendor the next morning, acquired a tracking number, and entered the postal stream with the wrong destination printed in clean black type. 3 days later, the mailing vendor's validation report flagged Unit B as a non-existent delivery point, and the postal tracking history changed to undeliverable as addressed. Meredith left it unchanged. At Lenora's house, the week moved quietly, with dry leaves whispering along the curb and the evening sprinklers releasing thin silver arcs across the lawns. No letter arrived in her mailbox, no email appeared in her portal, and no certified mail slip was tucked beneath her door. She continued her routine, watering the rosemary beside the porch, checking the brass numbers for loose screws, and writing the date on the grocery receipt she placed in her household file. Nothing seemed unusual. That was the point. On the 8th night, shortly after 9, the HOA golf cart rolled into the cul-de-sac with its headlights dimmed. Its tires made a soft rubber hiss against the pavement, then stopped outside Lenora's home. Meredith stepped down in narrow heels, crossed the walkway, and slid a cream envelope beneath the storm door without ringing the bell. The red stripe across its face read second and final notice. Inside, the association claimed Lenora had ignored an initial warning, a certified compliance demand, and a 7-day opportunity to cure. It listed $361.82 in accumulated charges and warned that continued noncompliance could trigger a $41.26 compliance revisit allocation after the next inspection. The wording was precise. The history was not. Under the governing documents, hand delivery could not retroactively begin the cure period or validate charges already created from a failed certified mailing. Lenora found the envelope the following morning while the neighborhood was still cool and the scent of wet cedar mulch hung near the hedges. She read the page once at the door, then again at the kitchen table beneath the steady ticking of an old wall clock. The document referred to prior notices by date, but none of those dates matched anything she had received. Lenora placed the envelope beside her notebook. She wrote down 6:38 a.m., the amount demanded, the absence of postage, and the phrase second and final notice. Then she examined the address block. Beneath her street address sat a line that had never existed before. Unit B. Lenora did not call Meredith. She did not open the HOA portal or send an angry email. She simply drew one straight line beneath those two words and closed the notebook. Someone had changed the record. Lenora began with the documents no one could reinterpret. The county parcel record identified 27 Copper Beach Court as one detached residence on a single residential lot, with no secondary dwelling, apartment designation, or internal unit number. Her property tax statement, utility account, homeowner's insurance declaration, and 12 years of prior HOA correspondence all displayed the same address. There was no Unit B. Late that morning, she spread the records across her dining table while sunlight moved slowly through the blinds and the refrigerator compressor clicked on in the adjoining kitchen. Outside, a leaf blower droned along the sidewalk, pushing dry oak leaves into uneven piles, and the smell of hot asphalt drifted through a cracked window as a maintenance crew patched the entrance road. Lenora placed the new violation notice beside an annual dues letter from the previous winter. The added line stood out immediately. She did not contact Meredith. Instead, Lenora opened a narrow gray filing cabinet that had remained locked since her retirement and removed a stack of archival folders, a steel ruler, and a magnifying lamp. For 28 years, she had reviewed administrative mailing systems for agencies and regulated contractors, tracing failures that most people dismissed as clerical mistakes. She knew a false address rarely appeared alone. It left a trail. Lenora created a chronology beginning with Meredith's visit at 8:17 a.m., then entered the 7-day compliance period, the dates cited on the final notice, and the morning the envelope appeared beneath her storm door. She marked each claimed mailing with a small empty square because no corresponding envelope, tracking slip, or delivery notice existed in her possession. The pattern was too clean. At 1:06 p.m., Lenora sent the management office a written records request through the resident portal. She asked for the complete violation file, every notice generated under her account, the destination address used for each mailing, all tracking numbers, and the account's address change history. Her wording was neutral and exact. She accused no one. For minutes later, the portal automatically confirmed receipt, and Lenora printed the confirmation page before the system could change. By evening, rain had begun tapping softly against the copper gutters, carrying the cold scent of wet soil across the cul-de-sac. The HOA golf cart passed once without stopping, its tires whispering over the dark pavement, while a porch light flickered on across the street. At 7:43 p.m., an email arrived from Meredith under the subject line Records Response, Administrative Summary. Attached was a polished PDF containing photographs of the brass numerals, a ledger of charges, and copies of notices bearing the invented unit designation. It did not include the tracking numbers. It did not include the address history. It did not include the return mail status. Lenora read the final paragraph twice. It stated that the association's records were presumed accurate and that further requests could result in a $47.83 document retrieval burden fee. The threat was almost useful. Lenora checked the PDF's file metadata and saw that the document had been generated that afternoon, even though the pages inside were presented as earlier records. The file showed what the HOA wanted her to see, not how the address had changed. She circled the missing audit history in blue ink and added one sentence to her chronology. They were preserving the accusation while removing the mechanism. Then Lenora closed the folder, turned off the magnifying lamp, and listened to the rain. This was no longer about brass numbers. The next morning, Lenora sent a second records request, this one limited to 5 questions and written in language too narrow to evade. She asked which destination address had been used for each notice, the tracking number assigned to every certified letter, the date each item entered the mail stream, the association rule defining an owner's official address, and the audit history showing who had altered her account. The message left her portal at 9:12 a.m., while a garbage truck groaned through the cul-de-sac and glass bottles rattled inside its metal hopper. She printed everything. Meredith replied before noon, not with answers, but with a warning that the association would not participate in serial administrative interference. Her email claimed the management platform had automatically selected the correct address and that residents were responsible for maintaining accurate contact information. A yellow banner at the bottom announced that Lenora's account had acquired a $72.94 administrative silence processing fee. The contradiction was almost elegant. Lenora saved the email in 3 formats, recorded its metadata, and added the new charge to her chronology. She then wrote directly to the outside management company, requesting the mailing vendor's transaction identifiers without explaining why she needed them. At the same time, she compared the HOA's governing documents with the annual contact verification form she had signed 6 months earlier. The enforcement section required formal notice to be mailed to the owner's verified address before any fine or response deadline could take effect, and her signed form listed only 27 Copper Beach Court. At dusk, the air turned dry and cool, carrying the smell of wood smoke from a fireplace several houses away. While returning from an evening walk near the neighborhood entrance, Lenora saw Meredith stop at the community mailbox cluster and unlock the association's designated mailbox. Meredith removed several envelopes, marked Return to Sender, and placed them inside her leather folio. Lenora noted the time without approaching her. The following afternoon, the management company sent a partial response containing a list of outbound mail reference numbers. It omitted the tracking results, but one footer identified the vendor and stated that certified items were processed through consolidated batch manifests. Lenora recognized the language immediately. A batch manifest would preserve the destination printed at acceptance, the individual tracking codes, and the initial postal scan. That record would not care what Meredith later claimed. Lenora submitted a precise request for the manifest covering the dates listed in her violation file. She also asked the management company to preserve all returned envelopes, address change logs, and administrator communications connected to her account. Her tone remained courteous. Her scope did not. 2 hours later, Paula Mercer forwarded the records response thread to Lenora without removing an earlier internal message from Meredith. The message instructed staff not to remove Unit B or discuss the address discrepancy until Lenora paid the outstanding balance and replaced the brass numerals. Meredith called the false unit designation a leverage point. Lenora read the sentence once. Outside, wind pushed dry leaves in circles around the curb, and the flag beside the clubhouse snapped sharply against its pole. She saved the email, printed it, and placed it behind the portal records. The mistake had become policy. Near midnight, a confirmation arrived from the mailing vendor stating that the requested batch manifest existed and had been placed under document hold pending release through the association's contracted manager. Lenora wrote the confirmation number in blue ink, closed the folder, and turned off the desk lamp. For the first time since Meredith appeared at her door, Lenora allowed herself a small smile. They had kept writing. The unexplained increase came from repeated continuation entries and duplicated administrative charges generated after each failed mailing. The portal now listed a $41.26 compliance revisit allocation, a $136.58 pre-collection file preparation charge, and a second $88.31 non-response continuation fee. Each line carried a green check mark labeled Board Authorized. The numbers looked obedient. At 7:30 that evening, residents gathered inside the Marfield Commons meeting room, where folding chairs scraped across vinyl flooring and the ceiling vents pushed out air that smelled of dust, lemon cleaner, and pool chlorine. A coffee urn hissed beside a tray of grocery store cookies, while rainwater tapped against the narrow windows near the roof. Meredith stood behind the front table in her familiar wine-colored blazer, her leather clipboard open beside a polished brass bell. She had an audience. Without naming Lenora, Meredith announced that one homeowner on Copper Beach Court had refused repeated opportunities to correct an exterior violation. She described the matter as chronic noncompliance, warned that selective obedience weakened community standards, and said the board had a duty to protect cooperative residents from those who treated rules as optional. Several people glanced toward Lenora's empty chair. Silence did the rest. Lenora had chosen not to attend because the meeting agenda contained no formal hearing on her account, but by the next morning, the story had traveled through the cul-de-sac. A neighbor who usually waved while walking her terrier looked down at her phone instead. Tessa Broom paused beside the mailbox cluster, offered a strained smile, and asked whether Lenora was having trouble with the association. Lenora said only that the records were incomplete. Tessa did not ask which records. At noon, a white envelope appeared beneath Lenora's windshield wiper while her car sat in the driveway. Its orange header read notice of collection eligibility, and the paper smelled faintly of copier heat and wet pavement. The letter warned that failure to pay within 10 business days could lead to referral to collection counsel, additional administrative expenses, and lien procedures permitted by the governing documents and applicable state law. The stated balance was now $2,037.46. Meredith had accelerated the schedule. Lenora photographed the envelope where it lay, recorded the weather, and lifted it with 2 fingers so the damp ink would not smear. Inside, Gideon Hallbrook's signature appeared beneath a certification that the ledger had been reviewed and found accurate. Gideon was the board treasurer, a retired bank officer known for measuring every lawn expense to the penny. Yet he had certified charges supported by notices no one had proven were delivered. Accuracy had become ceremonial. That afternoon, Lenora sent Gideon one question: "What delivery evidence did you review before certifying this balance?" He answered 43 minutes later that the board relied on management records and that postal documentation was not normally included in financial review. Lenora printed his reply. Then she opened the governing documents to the section on owner hearings and drafted a formal demand for one. She waived confidentiality and requested that every claimed notice destination address, returned envelope, and statement about her alleged refusal be presented in open session and entered into the minutes. Her message contained no accusation. It contained a deadline. 2 days later, Meredith approved the hearing and scheduled it for the following Thursday night, adding that Lenora would have 15 minutes to explain why the board should not confirm the full balance. Over the next 2 days, duplicated continuation entries and collection preparation charges added another $1,109.46. Lenora looked at the number, then at the vendor's preservation confirmation resting beside her notebook. Meredith believed the meeting would end the dispute. Lenora intended to make it part of the record. Meredith spent the days before the hearing constructing what she called the association's complete compliance record. She arranged photographs, fee schedules, portal screenshots, and copies of every notice inside a thick white binder labeled Chronic Noncompliance. Langford. The binder looked substantial beneath the fluorescent lights of the management office. Where the copier clicked, the air conditioner rattled, and the room smelled of paper dust and bitter coffee. Thickness was her strategy. Gideon Hallbrook reviewed the ledger at the clubhouse conference table, while Meredith explained that Lenora's silence proved deliberate resistance. He asked whether the certified mail receipts were included, and Meredith replied that delivery details were operational records rather than board evidence. She pointed instead to the green status icons printed from the portal, each one marked Notice Generated. Gideon accepted the distinction. He should not have. Across Copper Beach Court, Lenora worked with far less paper. The mailing vendor released the certified mail batch manifest on Tuesday afternoon after the management company's compliance officer approved Lenora's records request and confirmed that the preservation hold remained in place. It arrived as a 12-page PDF with batch identifiers, acceptance timestamps, destination fields, and tracking numbers corresponding to every notice listed in Meredith's binder. Lenora printed only the relevant page. Every line showed Unit B. She matched the tracking codes to the vendor references, then checked the postal events. Accepted, processed, attempted, undeliverable as addressed, returned to sender. The first letter had failed before the second fee was created. The rest followed anyway. Lenora placed the manifest beside her signed contact verification form, the governing provision requiring notice to the owner's address of record, and Meredith's internal email ordering staff not to correct the discrepancy. She added a one-page timeline showing that every penalty after the first mailing depended on a notice that had never reached a valid destination. Her entire hearing file fit inside a thin gray folder. 4 pages were enough. On Wednesday evening, Meredith drove the HOA golf cart to Lenora's house as the last sunlight faded behind the rooftops. Sprinklers hissed across neighboring lawns. Water struck the curb in sharp little bursts, and the damp air carried the smell of fertilizer and cooling pavement. Meredith remained seated behind the wheel, one hand resting on her clipboard. "You still have time to avoid a public embarrassment," she said. She offered to waive the latest $136.58 preparation charge if Lenora replaced the brass numerals and paid the remaining balance before noon. Lenora stood beside the walkway in her charcoal cardigan, listening without interruption. Meredith mistook patience for hesitation. "The board has every notice," she added. Lenora asked one question. "At the hearing, will you state the exact address used for each mailing?" Meredith's expression relaxed into a confident smile. She said the association had mailed every notice to the official address stored in its system and would say so for the record. Lenora nodded. "Please do." The golf cart rolled away, its electric motor fading beneath the chirp of crickets and the distant slam of a garage door. Inside, Lenora checked the manifest one final time and marked 3 questions at the top of her notes. Was the system address official? Were all notices sent there? Did every fine depend on valid notice? Meredith had already answered them privately. Tomorrow, she would answer them in public. By 7 o'clock Thursday evening, every folding chair in the Marfield Commons meeting room was occupied. Rain streaked the narrow windows. Wet coats gave off the smell of wool and cold pavement, and the ceiling fan clicked once with every slow rotation. Meredith sat beneath the association seal in her familiar wine-colored blazer, with her white binder open and the brass bell positioned beside her right hand. She looked entirely at home. Lenora took a seat at the end of the front row with a thin gray folder resting across her knees. Tessa Broom sat 2 chairs behind her, while Gideon Holbrook arranged the ledger, meeting minutes, and voting sheet in careful stacks. The room settled into the strained quiet of people expecting a public correction. Meredith rang the bell. She described the brass numerals as an unresolved architectural violation and presented photographs taken from 3 different angles. She read each charge aloud, including the $219.84 facade numeral uniformity assessment, the $72.94 administrative silence processing fee, and the $136.58 pre-collection file preparation charge. Then she displayed the final balance of $3,146.92 on a portable screen. The number filled the wall. Meredith told the residents that Lenora had received repeated notices, ignored multiple deadlines, and forced the board to spend community resources on avoidable enforcement. She held up copies of the letters as proof, though none included evidence of successful delivery. Gideon shifted in his chair, but said nothing. Meredith smiled. When Lenora's turn began, she did not open her folder. She asked whether the address stored in the management system was considered her official mailing address for enforcement purposes. Meredith said yes. Lenora asked whether every notice supporting the balance had been mailed to that address. Meredith said they had. Lenora asked whether the fines depended on valid notice and an opportunity to respond. Meredith glanced toward Gideon, then answered that proper notice was the foundation of the association's process. 3 answers entered the minutes. Lenora opened the folder. She handed Gideon the certified mail batch manifest and asked him to read the destination field beside the first tracking number. His lips moved before any sound came out. 27 Copper Beach Court, Unit B. Lenora asked him to read the destination on the remaining entries. Each one was the same. She then placed her county parcel record, utility statement, signed contact verification form, and prior HOA correspondence beside the manifest. None contained a unit designation. There was no Unit B. A low murmur moved through the room as Gideon read the postal events printed beside each tracking code. Attempted, undeliverable as addressed, returned to sender. The first notice had failed before the second penalty was assessed. The second had failed before the third. Every later fee rested on the same broken foundation. Meredith leaned toward the microphone and called it a minor clerical discrepancy. Lenora slid the internal email across the table, the one instructing staff not to correct the address until payment was made. The room went still. A clerical error is corrected when discovered, Lenora said. This one was preserved as leverage. Meredith reached for the binder, but its thickness no longer mattered. Gideon compared the manifest with the ledger he had certified, then removed the voting sheet from the table. A board member at the far end of the table requested immediate suspension of Meredith's system access, pending an independent review. Another seconded the motion. Meredith raised the bell, but no one stopped talking. Her authority had ended before the vote began. The board suspended Meredith's system access before the meeting ended, and by sunrise the management company had frozen every collection file connected to her administrator account. A temporary notice appeared on the resident portal stating that disputed balances would not accrue new charges during review. Outside the clubhouse, rainwater drained through the gutters with a hollow metallic rush, and the wet parking lot smelled of pine needles, motor oil, and cold concrete. The machinery had stopped. Lenora's $3,146.92 balance disappeared from the portal the following afternoon, replaced by a gray banner reading account under correction. Gideon called her from the management office and admitted that the board had never reviewed delivery evidence before approving the charges. He offered to send a written confirmation that every assessment tied to the fail notices had been voided. Lenora asked him to include the word invalid rather than waived. Words mattered. The independent review began with Meredith's login history and expanded within 3 days to to every address change made during her presidency. Auditors found 6 resident accounts altered without sign verification, including an elderly homeowner whose notices had been redirected to a former rental address, and a traveling nurse whose correspondence had been assigned an incorrect apartment number. 2 accounts had accumulated late fees after returned envelopes were placed in storage without correction. The pattern was wider than Lenora. At the next special meeting, the clubhouse smelled of burnt coffee and fresh printer ink, and the crowd filled the room before the board members arrived. Residents carried folders, returned envelopes, and portal screenshots of their own. Meredith sat alone near the side wall without her badge, clipboard, or place at the front table. No one asked her advice. Gideon read the auditor's preliminary findings in a voice that grew quieter with each page. The association faced $18,742.63 in refunds, professional review costs, and administrative corrections, not including Lenora's documented expenses. The board's insurer warned that future enforcement dispute coverage could be restricted unless the association adopted immediate corrective controls. The operating budget tightened overnight, forcing the board to postpone 2 discretionary landscaping projects. Meredith attempted to explain that address adjustments had been made to improve delivery efficiency and preserve compliance continuity. Paula Mercer testified that she had questioned the Unit B entry and had been told it was an authorized correction. The internal email was entered into the minutes again, this time beside the return mail logs. Meredith's explanation collapsed under its own language. The board voted 6-1 to remove her as president, revoke her administrative privileges, and prohibit her from handling resident records. The same board resolution removed her from the architectural committee. Lenora received reimbursement for document fees, certified copy costs, and other documented administrative expenses, along with a written acknowledgement that the numeral rule had never been properly adopted for retroactive enforcement. No one applauded when the vote was announced. The silence was worse. Meredith stood, gathered a thin stack of personal papers, and walked toward the exit while her narrow heels struck the vinyl floor in hard, uneven taps. Tessa Broom moved her chair aside without looking at her. Gideon removed the brass president's nameplate from the table and placed it face down. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled clean enough to make the room behind them feel stale. Meredith left without authority, without an audience, and without the record she had trusted to protect her. The final legal blow arrived 11 days later in a letter from the association's civil counsel, delivered to Lenora's mailbox at 10:14 on a bright, windless morning. The envelope carried the correct address, no unit designation, and a certified mail barcode that matched the receipt in the carrier's hand. Inside was a written board determination on notice validity, prepared by association counsel and adopted after review of the governing documents, the vendor records, and the single batch manifest Lenora had produced at the hearing. One record had undone everything. The determination stated that the association's enforcement process required each notice to be mailed to the owner's verified address of record before any response deadline, continuation charge, collection expense, or hearing consequence could arise. The manifest proved that every notice supporting Lenora's account had been addressed to a non-existent Unit B and returned as undeliverable. Because valid notice had never occurred, the first assessment had never matured into an enforceable charge, and every later fee derived from it was legally dependent on a failure that did not belong to Lenora. The entire chain was void. The board's resolution listed each amount separately: $219.84, $53.67, $88.31, $41.26, $72.94, $136.58, and every repeated or compounded entry that had raised the balance to $3,146.92. Beside each line appeared the same word in capital letters: invalid. No waber. No courtesy adjustment. No compromise. The association also withdrew the collection notice, corrected Lenora's owner ledger, restored her account to a zero balance, and agreed that no part of the dispute could be used in future enforcement decisions. Meredith's prior approvals were flagged for review. Her authority to approve future enforcement actions was permanently revoked, and the board approved reimbursement for Lenora's documented expenses. The brass numerals remained untouched. That afternoon, the management company activated a temporary lock preventing any mailing address change without written owner approval. Over the next month, the software vendor implemented a permanent two-step verification system requiring confirmation at both the existing and proposed address. Every modification would now create a permanent audit trail showing the date, time, user account, and reason for the change. Return mail could no longer be stored silently. It had to trigger an automatic enforcement hold. The system finally had memory. Over the next month, the association reopened every penalty file connected to unverified address changes. Several older residents received refunds, 2 pending collection referrals were canceled, and one homeowner learned that months of so-called non-response fees had come from notices sent to a former mailing address she had left years earlier. Tessa Broom apologized to Lenora beside the mailbox cluster while cicadas buzzed in the maple trees and warm air carried the scent of sun-baked grass. Lenora accepted without ceremony. She had never won an audience. On a quiet Saturday morning, Lenora sat on her porch with coffee while sprinklers ticked across the lawns and the mail truck stopped at the community cluster near the neighborhood entrance. A few minutes later, she walked down, unlocked her compartment, and found a white envelope inside. Lenora checked the label before carrying it indoors. Her name was correct. The street was correct. Nothing had been added. Justice had not arrived through shouting, humiliation, or force. It had arrived through one preserved postal record, read carefully enough to expose every false assumption built above it. Meredith had treated administrative power as something residents were required to trust. Lenora left behind a different rule. Authority must be able to prove what it claims. The neighborhood became quieter after that, but not weaker. People asked for records, checked their notices, and understood that silence could no longer be manufactured and used against them. Lenora returned to her books, her Rosemary, and the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The brass numerals stayed. The system changed. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.